So, although the recent Nintendo Direct didn't exactly light the world on fire, at least for me, in terms of new game announcements coming to the Nintendo Switch, there were some interesting stories that have emerged now that the dust has settled during this event. And one of the stories I want to talk about today is something that's definitely starting to pick up steam online. People are noticing some very interesting anomalies within this Nintendo Direct, and primarily one of the companies that seems to now be putting quite a few more games onto Nintendo platforms, and how this will play into the Nintendo Switch 2, as these games were confirmed for the original Nintendo Switch. But what does that mean for the Switch 2 as well? Because it seems like this partnership is somewhat budding. I want to talk about basically what people are talking about, maybe give a little bit more of clarity and insight into the situation, and see if we could come up with a conclusion. Now, two games that were revealed during this Nintendo Direct weren't exactly super high on my list of anticipated titles, with Patapon 1 and 2 Replay and Everybody's Golf Hot Shots. Now, on the surface level, you see these two games and you're like, well, okay, Patapon 1 and 2, kind of a quirky game. Everybody's Golf Hot Shots, an arcadey style golf game, not exactly, banner titles, not exactly games that are going to pique a lot of people's interest. So what's the big deal about these two titles? Well, if you know anything about your video game history, you would know that these are actually PlayStation games and PlayStation properties. Now, this isn't the first time that we've seen PlayStation games appear on the Nintendo Switch. Of course, MLB The Show has started to come to the system, and I mean, that's not really at the fault of PlayStation. That's not really PlayStation's decision to do that. I think they wanted to keep that exclusive. However, the MLB stepped in and said, hey, we want to sell more copies of this game, so we need this game available on more platforms. And then, of course, MLB The Show ended up on platforms such as the Nintendo Switch and the Xbox family of systems. So I never really saw that as like a super huge deal, just because of the fact that that was kind of outside of Sony and PlayStation's control when it came to what systems that game was going to be on. The more interesting one, though, was a game that released last year with Lego Horizon Adventures, a game that was released for the PlayStation 5 and the Nintendo Switch. Now, Aloy is a flagship character for Sony when it comes to their properties. I mean, Aloy is arguably one of the biggest Sony characters right now in terms of game sales. The Horizon series has sold over 40 million plus copies on various PlayStation platforms, so this is a very strong IP for PlayStation. Now, there was lots of confusion as to who made this call. Did Sony want to put it on the Nintendo Switch, or did Lego want to do it? And it seems like amidst that confusion, we did learn that this was actually Sony's decision. They wanted to expand the brand. They wanted to get it on different platforms such as the Nintendo Switch along with the PC, and so that's how that came to be. So that was kind of setting the table for this. And going back to Patapon 1 and 2 Replay and Everybody's Golf Hot Shots, these are games that were PlayStation exclusive. They were developed by PlayStation Studios in Japan, Sony of Japan, and these were games that, Everybody's Golf used to be called Hot Shots Golf, and it was a very popular game back in the day. And Patapon 1 and 2 were PSP games. I'm not sure if maybe Patapon 2 was a Vita game. I'm not really into the Patapon series, but these games are now coming to the Nintendo Switch. Now, Sony isn't actually the ones that are putting the games on the Switch. Bandai Namco is. And that kind of throws a little bit of a wrinkle in the discussion. And once you kind of start to look a bit deeper, I think you can kind of see what is happening here. Because there was another game that recently came out on the Nintendo Switch that was a PlayStation Vita exclusive game. And that was Freedom Wars. Now, Freedom Wars was one of the flagship PlayStation Vita games, and one of the highest rated games on the system, a game that a lot of people have very fond memories of who picked up a PlayStation Vita. I actually own it. Unfortunately, you can't play the game online anymore, which kind of was a bit of a key component to the game, but the historical value of that as a very important title for the PSP or the PS Vita made it very interesting that this game was re-released for both PlayStation and Nintendo Switch. So this was also done by Bandai Namco. So to me, this is kind of how I'm viewing it, because Sony of Japan, PlayStation Studios Japan no longer exists. Sony shut them down. And with that, the team kind of dissolved. Some of them went to Team Asobi, who of course does like Astrobot and stuff like that. And that's why Astrobot was such a, well-received game by a lot of people, because, Western Sony, they like to do, the third person gripping narrative, serious business game, and like, very cinematic, very movie-like, whereas Astrobot was just like, all right, here's a fun 3D platformer with some pretty graphics and some cool mechanics. And like everyone cheered for that. Everyone thoroughly enjoyed that. But that's where most of Sony of Japan's studio is now. And since those properties are kind of completely dormant, Bandai Namco has essentially stepped in and been like, hey, let's put these games, make modern versions of them, polish them up a little bit in terms of graphics, and put them on PlayStation and put them on Nintendo Switch. Notice how Xbox isn't a part of this equation. I still don't think PlayStation really views the Nintendo Switch as a direct competitor, and I don't think that's ever really going to change unless the Nintendo Switch 2 is just like super powerful or something like that. But saying all of that, you kind of have to look towards the future, because there are plenty more, Sony Japan properties that could end up seeing a release on the Nintendo Switch, and primarily the Nintendo Switch 2, because, we're kind of moving on from the Switch 1. I could see potentially like Gravity Rush end up on the Nintendo Switch 2. Like, that was a very well-received game critically. It didn't sell all that great. It was a PS Vita game that did end up getting a home console version as well, and people really love it. People that have played Gravity Rush are like super big fans of it, but people that haven't played it don't really understand it, it seems. But Gravity Rush is a very popular franchise in terms of like a cult following. And I think a resurgence of that could actually be very beneficial for Sony. And although Sony isn't doing all of the work, this is still their properties. These are still first-party IP games, games that Sony has the rights to, that they are now giving to Bandai Namco and allowing them to put these games on the current Nintendo Switch and, of course, by extension, the Nintendo Switch 2. Now, I don't necessarily think you're going to see, like, God of War games on the Switch 2, but maybe if there's a compilation, could you see an Uncharted compilation, get a little Nathan Drake on the Nintendo Switch 2? I mean, Sony has to look at things like that and be like, well, we're not doing anything with this compilation. We've already released it on our platforms. We've already released it on PC. Like, we can either let them sit there, or maybe we could consider putting them on the Nintendo Switch 2 as well, because why not? You could pick up a little bit of extra money. I think Sony is definitely starting to explore other avenues. When you hear the new president of Sony talk about wanting more day-in-date games on PC when it comes to their bigger first-party properties, like, it's very interesting to think about, and it's very interesting to see, because Sony is pretty headstrong with stuff. You got to remember, during the whole Fortnite debacle, Sony didn't want cross-platform play. They didn't want cross-platform chat, because the best place to play was on PlayStation 4. Sean Layden wasn't taking no gruff from anyone. But Sean Layden is gone, and there is a new regime there, and this new regime, I mean, they're dipping their toes into the Nintendo Switch. It's not a full-on, dive into the ocean or anything like that. But there's definitely some things that are happening. And, the more games, even if they're smaller games, I feel like a lot of PlayStation ponies will be like, oh, well, it's only Patapon. It's only everybody's golf hotshots, but it used to be just, oh, it's only Freedom Wars. It used to be, oh, it's just Lego Horizon Adventures. It used to be, oh, it's only MLB The Show. I'm just saying, look at what happened with Xbox. It went from 4 games to a full damn slate. You want your Indiana Jones? We're making it special for the PS5 Pro, and it'll run even better than on the Xbox Series X. Crazy times we live in, folks. Very crazy times, but I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to adjust to it, and I'm trying to understand these companies' positions. And, I think with select titles for PlayStation, it's not the end of the world, but would Nintendo do that? Is Nintendo going to put a game on PlayStation or Xbox? I mean, I told you guys last year, Nintendo won the console wars. You could say whatever the hell you want, but if they're the only company that is sustaining enough to only put their properties onto their platforms with no exceptions, console wars are over, boys. And somehow the weakest console won. But if you look at historically speaking, that's what usually happens anyways. Anyways, guys, let me know what you think of this in the comments section down below. And what are some PlayStation properties that you could foresee coming to the Switch too? If you want to be realistic, I would keep it with mostly Sony of Japan games, maybe some offshoot games. I know they made some like weird RPGs and stuff like that as well. PSP, PS Vita games, I think are definitely fair game to get a re-released through Bandai Namco on the Nintendo Switch 2. And, what are some of your dream games as well? I would like to see like Uncharted and stuff like that because, Nintendo's never going to make an Uncharted style game. Like, let's just be realistic. So why not have someone kind of fill that void? And Gran Turismo. Give me Gran Turismo on the Switch too, damn it. Like, that would be a lot of fun, I think. I want that. I really want that. I love Gran Turismo. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. Be sure to like, comment, share. Hit the bell as well. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.